Hello, welcome to the lecture 7 of week 2. This is the NPTEL online course entitled Introduction to Language and Linguistics. This is Dripta. The title of today's lecture is Rules of Language. So, we will be talking about the following topics in today's class. What is the nature of the rules of language? If we can learn something about the rules from child language data, if we can create limitless sentences, whether rules and meaning are related, whether there are different kinds of rules, and the relationship between rules and our tacit knowledge. If you remember, I asked you to do an exercise. I hope some of you have already done this exercise. If you have forgotten, let me remind you. I asked you to create some ungrammatical sentences in your own language. So, I am assuming that you have done the exercise. Now, I am asking you what are the strategies that you used for creating the ungrammatical sentences. I am asking you to think about the strategies along with the examples. Basically, we forced you to think about the idea of ungrammaticality. I am sure you remembered the idea of ungrammaticality that we have already discussed in the previous classes, and you also have got the idea that we have the judgment of well formed and ill formed sentences, and it is related to our knowledge of language. So, we also talked about this idea that every string of words, I mean if we create a different string of words, these are not well formed sentences. So, now you know that all these examples are examples of ungrammatical constructions. The man located, this is ungrammatical. Tina is fond that her children love animals, there is something wrong. The children laughed the man, there is also something wrong, and it rains a bowl of sun. So, all these sentences are ungrammatical, and I am asking you to think about the fact that not every string of words constitute well formed sentences. You just cannot combine some linguistic items and create a string of words, and you can tell us that this is well formed. So, these are some of the concepts which are related to the rules of language. We follow the rules of language to form sentences in a language. This is something that all of us know, right? I mean, why we are talking about rules of language? Because we are talking about formation of sentences as well. The rules are finite in length and finite in number. They can be stored in our brain. We already talked about the innateness hypothesis, if you remember. So, there is a relationship between our knowledge of language and the brain, and the rules permit us to form and understand infinite number of sentences. We also talked about it previously. Now, let us get some examples from child language data. I have listed 3 different types of data for you, and I am asking you to look at the data carefully. So, when we are looking at child language data, we are asking these questions to ourselves. What do we learn from this data? Why we are dealing with these data while talking about rules of language? And if you are familiar with this term, over generalization, some of you are, because some of you are have already done some courses in linguistics. So, you are familiar with this concept of language acquisition. So, for them I have this question, if you remember this term over generalization in terms of rules. The first example, example A, is basically talking about the suffix ed, which children often add to irregular verbs like daddy goed to office. So, instead of using went, they generally say goed to office, so, or add ed with a number of irregular verbs. Example B is a different kind of example. So, when it's no singing, basically the child wants to say she is not singing. So, something is missing, right, here. So, I am also asking you to think about the second example, and the third example is conversation data, and this is a very popular example in language acquisition research. I am sure some of you are familiar with it. The child is saying nobody don't like me. You can understand the problem, right? I mean, there are two different items with negation. Mother is saying no, say nobody likes me. Child, nobody don't like me. Then 8 repetitions of this dialogue, and this is important because again and again the caregiver is trying to correct the child, to rectify. Then the mother is saying no, now listen carefully, say nobody likes me. Then the child says, oh, nobody don't likes me. So, what is this particular example, and all 3 examples are telling us that there is some importance of the rules when we talk about child language data, and it also helps us to understand rules of language as a whole. This is a very famous test called the WUG test. It is meant for the children for understanding the acquisition of plurals. So, if you give this sheet to a child and or show this picture to a child and says that this is a WUG, now there is another one, there are 2 of them, then you can say there are 2 dash. So, the child is supposed to generalize the rule that it should be WUGs. If the child can't write the term WUGs, then you have to understand that the child has not mastered the rule of plural formation in English. So, child language data tells us about the acquisition of rules. We are not talking about acquisition in this class, but rather I am asking you to focus on the rule component. So, what actually do we learn from child language data? So, there are very well known child language data archives, for example, the child's corpora that you can I will share the reference with you later. So, you can go through the data, more data, or you can bring your own data from any child around you who speaks the language that you know or you speak, and try to figure out about their rules. The rules and their combinations, or I mean we are talking about the grammar of course, they generate infinitely many possible sentences. So, this is something that we are discussing we have also discussed this in some previous classes, and we are focusing this factor again when we are talking about the rules of language. So, data from language acquisition, specifically child language acquisition, can be helpful for us to understand the rules. Now, let us look at some examples. We will try to see what is happening here. The first sentence is the cat chased the mouse. The second sentence is the cat chased the mouse that ate the cheese. The third sentence is the cat chased the mouse that ate the cheese that came from the cow. And the fourth sentence is the cat chased the mouse that ate the cheese that came from the cow that grazed in the field. So, I am sure by now you have understood the mechanism. We are basically trying to play with the length of the sentence. We are adding some more component to the sentence and making it longer. But what exactly are we doing here? Are we doing something which is related to the rule? You can ask this question to yourself and figure out that yes, we are actually trying to talk about a rule of human language that sentences can be limitless. So, any speaker can continue creating sentences by adding different elements. It can be an adjective, it can be a prepositional phrase or relative clause, which you have seen in the examples. So, I am asking you to reflect and think about these examples, because we are talking about a major property of human language. We can make limitless sentences, and this process can actually continue forever. We can create a very big sentence, and even then the sentence has the potential of adding more elements to it. But whenever we are adding different components or different linguistic items to a sentence, we have to follow the rules. We cannot disobey the rules. This is something that we need to understand. So, there are some more notions which are related to rules. Let us go through them. We know that the sentences are not stored in our head. So, if you remember Chomskyan definition of language, we already discussed the definition, and we said that we do not learn by imitation, we do not have all the sentences in our head. So, we do not store the sentences. Sentences are basically composed of discrete units that are combined by rules. I am asking you to pay attention to this point, because we are talking about a number of important aspects. We are talking about some discrete units which are combined by rules. Both are important for us. So, we will be talking about these discrete units later in this course in different layers, and we are now talking about the rules, and we have to come back to rules again and again, because this is a very basic platform of the discipline. The system of rules can tell us how speaker stores infinite knowledge in a finite space, which is our brain. So, when we investigate rules in different languages, and as a native speaker you can talk about the well formedness and ill formedness of the sentences, and if you comment on rules, if you analyze the rules, it can help you to understand the knowledge of language. We will come back to the basic idea again and again. So, now I am asking you to think about a very simple rule in your language, which is the word order. So, what is the word order, basic word order in your language? So, it can be subject, object, verb, SOV, it can be subject, verb, object, SVO, and you may also figure out that the word order in your language is very different from the word order of English. So, these are certain rules which are restrictions of usage in your language or English, right. So, word order is a very simple and basic example of rules that we always follow in order to create sentences. So, rules are basically necessary to characterize the infinite possibilities of natural language. So, we will always say natural language because of obvious reasons, but we will be talking about the infinite possibilities and coming back to rules. And rules have a number of other properties. We will be talking about those properties briefly. If you remember, when we talked about different levels, the levels of representations are defined by rules that yield them as their output. So, if you think about this sentence for more advanced students, you can also think about from a theoretical point of view, from a syntactic point of view I mean. What do we mean by this? Levels of representations are defined by rules that yield them as their output. So, what is the output that we are getting and what is the relationship between the rules and the output? This is something that we always try to investigate, right. And rules help us to understand the generalization that go beyond lexical items. So, some of us think that if we talk about the lexical items or the vocabulary of language, that is the basic part, but actually it is not. You have understood by now that we are talking about a very new way of talking about language through language. So, we will definitely talk about generalizations based on rules which are beyond the lexical items. For example, you can say that all verbs have past tense, not just the past form. So, past tense is also a component. This is something that we have to understand. So, if you think about meanings, because meaning is something that goes hand in hand with the structure, we will see for different levels. So, rules account for meanings, and for more advanced students I am talking about semantic compositionality. So, for example, if we talk about meanings of larger entities, we know that meanings of larger entities are created with the meanings of smaller entities. So, I have a very small example here, a sentence. So, if you think about the meaning of the entire sentence, I do not like milk, the meaning of the sentence is built up from the meaning of all these smaller components, I do not like and milk. All of them have separate meanings, and together they are building up a meaning which is the meaning of the entire sentence. So, that is how we are talking about compositionality, and if you are a basic learner of linguistics, you have to remember this fact that rules always account for meaning. We cannot get rid of meaning when we talk about rules. There are two sentences here, and we have to pay attention to these sentences again, because they are talking about a very important component of rules, which is useful for us in contemporary linguistic theory. There are many cats in the room, but they are hiding. So, I can say the same sentence in a different way, or I can convey the same meaning in a slightly different way. Many cats are in the room, but are hiding. So, there is a dash here. So, I am sure you can get the point what I am trying to indicate. There is a reason for putting this dash here, right. There is some understood subject or empty subject, if you think about the sentence carefully. So, Chomsky and many other linguists who work in the relevant domain, they say that there are two different kinds of rules involved here, and we will be talking about these two different kinds of rules and know their names as well. So, the first one is a rule named merge. So, we can say that a rule that merges two words to form a larger constituent. We will come back to this term constituent again when we will be doing syntax. So, for now you have to understand that we are talking about something called sentence, a larger part, and here we are talking about the examples many and cats. So, many is a word, cats is a word, we are combining them together to create a larger constituent which is many cats. So, this operation is known as merge, or the name of the rule which is basically combining them is known as merge. The next rule is, or the next operation is known as move. Move is basically I mean we can understand from this example, it is moving a constituent to different positions. So, if you think about the example that we were discussing, many cats. So, here I am not saying only many, but many cats, the entire chunk is moving to the front of a sentence when we are talking about the second sentence in the examples. You can always go back to them and check them again. So, merge and move are two important rules. I think you understood them, and for now let us keep in mind that these two important rules are helpful for us to understand, because we will be explaining the structure of sentences and the knowledge of language with the help of these two important rules. So, all of us basically have the knowledge of these rules, but it is very important for us to know that we are not aware of them. We do not think seriously about the rules that operate in the creation of sentences in our everyday life, but this is our job as linguists. We do analyze sentences and of course, other components of language. We can also analyze rules of sound patterns or word forms, for example. So, we basically try to talk about some knowledge which is unconscious knowledge. These rules are part of our unconscious or tacit knowledge that we can mention at this point. So, a feature of human beings is who can produce and understand n number of sentences. This is something that we already know, and we can make judgments, well formedness and ill formedness, but the rules are always super helpful for us. We have to keep that in mind. So, coming to the conclusion, let us sum up to whatever we have learnt today in this class. The rules of language are related to our knowledge of language. We already talked about the knowledge of language. We did discuss some child language data and argued that child language data helps us to understand the nature of rules, because it shows how it is shaped. And we also talked about the fact that sentences are created with discrete units that are combined by rules. We did mention that rules have different properties and there are different types of rules. Example, we discussed 2 different types of rules involving the ideas merge and move. So, these are the key references that you can check for this class. Thank you.